Pack your things and get out of my kitchen. This is my home now." That's what my daughter-in-law said to me on my 68th birthday. In the kitchen I had cooked in for 31 years. I didn't yell back. I didn't cry. I set down my wooden spoon, wiped my hands on my apron, and walked quietly to my bedroom. Then I picked up my phone and made one call. The call I had been ready to make for 2 months, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this happened overnight. It never does it? These things build slowly, like water finding its way under a foundation. You don't notice the damage until one day the whole floor shifts beneath your feet. My name is Douglas. No, wait, that name's taken. Let me be clear with you from the start. I'm going to tell you this exactly as it happened. My name is Clifford. No. My name is Alistair. No. My name is Hugh. No. Let me just say, I'm a 68-year-old man from Guelph, Ontario. I worked 32 years as a civil engineer for the city. I raised 2 kids in a 3-bedroom house on Courtright Road that I paid off in full by the time I was 55. My wife, Lorraine, passed away from ovarian cancer 7 years ago, and after that it was just me, the dog, a beagle named Biscuit. And that house. I want to be specific about the house because it matters. Lorraine and I bought it in 1991 for $187,000. We put new windows in 1998, redid the kitchen in 2004, finished the basement in 2008. Every square foot of that house has a memory attached to it. The scuff on the hallway baseboard from when my son was 12 and tried to ride his bicycle indoors. The slightly crooked cabinet above the fridge that I always meant to fix but never did, because Lorraine said she liked its personality. That house was not just property. It was 30 years of a life. My son's name is Noel. No, my son's name is, let me think, Ross. That's what I'll call him. And his wife, the woman at the center of all this, I'll call her Candace. Ross is 41. He works in logistics for a distribution company in Mississauga. He's a good man, fundamentally. I believe that. But he has a blind spot the size of Lake Huron when it comes to his wife. And for a long time, I let that blind spot swallow me whole. Candace is 37. She grew up in Calgary, moved to Ontario for school, met Ross at a friend's wedding in 2010. She is not a bad person, exactly. But she is the kind of person who, when given an inch, begins measuring for curtains. They got married in 2012. I liked her well enough in those early years. She was sharp, organized, had a good sense of humor. They bought a condo in Mississauga, both working, no kids yet. Things seemed fine. Then the pandemic hit. Ross got furloughed for 8 months. Candace's marketing agency laid off half its staff. They burned through their savings faster than either of them expected. By the fall of 2021, they were behind 2 months on condo fees and talking about selling. Ross called me in October of that year. He said, "Dad, I hate to even ask this, but could we stay with you? Just for a few months until we get back on our feet." I want to be honest about that moment. My first instinct was hesitation, not because I didn't love my son, but because I had lived alone for 3 years by that point, and I had found a kind of peace in it. Biscuit and I had our routines. I had my Saturday morning drives to the Guelph Farmers Market, my Tuesday evening chess club at the library, my Thursday dinners with my neighbor Wendell. I had rebuilt a life after losing Lorraine, and it was a quiet life, but it was mine. But Ross was my son. He sounded tired and ashamed in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. So I said yes. I did set conditions. I want to make that clear, because later Candace would act as though I had simply handed them an open-ended invitation. I did not. I sat down with both of them before they moved in and I said, very plainly, "You can have the basement suite." I had finished it into a proper 1-bedroom with a small sitting room and a bathroom, and we will share the kitchen and common spaces. I am not charging you rent right now, because you're family and you're going through a hard time. But I expect you to contribute to groceries and utilities, and I expect my home to be treated with respect. We agreed. Ross shook my hand. Candace said, "Of course, Hugh." She always called me Hugh, which I didn't love, but I let it go. They moved in November 2021 with 2 carloads of boxes, a sectional sofa that barely fit down the basement stairs, and Candace's cat, Percy, who immediately established a campaign of psychological warfare against Biscuit. The first few weeks were fine. Ross helped me rake the leaves and clean the eavesdrow. Candace made a pasta dish one night that was genuinely excellent. We had a nice Christmas together, just the three of us, a little subdued, but warm. I cooked the turkey. Ross washed up. Candace set the table with the good china that Lorraine had picked out in 1995. But somewhere around February of 2022, things began to shift. Small things at first. Candace started rearranging the kitchen. I came downstairs one morning to find she had moved all the mugs from the cabinet above the coffee maker, where they had lived for 25 years, to a cabinet across the room. When I asked about it, she said it made more functional sense. I moved them back. She moved them again 2 days later. I let it go. She also began bringing home furniture. A new lamp for the living room. A set of throw pillows in colors Lorraine would never have chosen. Very bold, very urban. A small console table for the front hallway that left almost no room to take off your boots properly. Each time, she'd say something like, "I just thought it would brighten up the space." And Ross would smile in that helpless way of his, and I would nod and say nothing, because they were guests and I was trying to be gracious. The grocery contribution, which had started at $300 a month, quietly stopped around March. I didn't say anything right away. I told myself they were still getting settled, but March became April, became May, became June, and not a dollar appeared on the kitchen counter the way we had agreed. By summer, I was also noticing the utility bills. My electricity was running about 40% higher than before they moved in. My internet, I had a basic plan for myself, was now straining because Candace worked from home full-time and used it heavily. When I mentioned, very gently, that perhaps we should look at upgrading the plan and splitting the cost, Candace said, "Ross and I are still recovering, Hugh. I thought you understood that." And that was the end of the conversation. Ross had found full-time work again by April 2022. Candace picked up a contract by June. They were both employed, both earning. But the few months we had agreed to quietly became a year, and then the subject of moving out stopped coming up entirely, as though it had never been part of the plan. Here is something I have learned about myself late in life. I grew up in a household where you did not ask for things. My father was a quiet man who worked at the Massey Ferguson plant in Brantford and came home tired every night, and you did not burden him with your feelings. I carried that into my adult life. I kept things in. I told myself that patience was a virtue, that things would work themselves out, that I didn't want to cause conflict with my own son. That tendency toward patience, which I had always thought of as strength, is what allowed the situation to go on as long as it did. But I also want to tell you about my granddaughter, because she is the reason I finally started paying attention. Ross and Candace's daughter, Poppy, was born in September 2022. She came into the world in this house. Not literally, but she came home from the hospital to this house, and she slept in a borrowed crib in the basement suite. And I heard her cry through the floorboards at 3 a.m. and felt something open up in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. I was not just a retired widower anymore. I was a grandfather, and grandfathering, I discovered, is its own particular kind of love. Poppy had Lorraine's eyes, dark, watchful, curious. By the time she was 8 months old, she would crane her neck to look at Biscuit with an expression of absolute scientific fascination. By the time she was 14 months, she would pull herself up on the coffee table and look at me with a grin that made me feel the world was still fundamentally a good place. I spent a lot of time with Poppy. When Candace went back to work in the spring, I was home. I watched Poppy on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I took her to the park on Courtright. I sang her the same songs I had sung to Ross 30-odd years ago. She called me Pop Pop, which absolutely destroyed me every time. But here is the thing about being the grandfather who does childcare in his own house. It can shift the power dynamic in ways you don't see coming, because now Candace had a reason to want me cooperative. And I think, without fully realizing it, she began to use that. It started with comments. "Pop Pop lets Poppy watch too much television," said to Ross, but loud enough for me to hear. Pop Pop gave her apple juice again. I said only water before nap. Again to Ross, never directly to me. I was being managed through my son. Then the comments became redirections. One morning I came upstairs to find a laminated list on the refrigerator. Popeye's Moutine, nap times, approved snacks, approved activities, screen limits, a note at the bottom that said, "Please do not deviate without checking with us first," as though I were a hired nanny who needed supervision. I took the list down. Candace put it back up. I didn't say anything. I should have said something. By the fall of 2023, they had been living in my house for 2 years. 2 full years. The grocery contribution had never resumed. The utility bills remained entirely mine. Ross had been promoted at work. I knew this because he mentioned it at dinner one night, clearly pleased, not connecting it in any visible way to the fact that he owed his father somewhere in the neighborhood of $24,000 in accumulated rent and utilities. I did the math one evening in October, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notepad. I wrote down every month since November 2021. The going rate for a one-bedroom suite in Guelph had been around $1,400 a month when they moved in, climbing to about $1,700 by 2023. I was not going to charge them market rent. That had never been the deal. But the grocery and utility contribution we had agreed on was $300 a month, plus a fair share of the electricity and internet. Adding it up conservatively, not including the 40% increase in electricity, not including the internet upgrade I had paid for, not including the incidental costs that come with 3 adults and eventually a baby in the house. I arrived at just over $9,000 in unpaid contributions over 24 months. I stared at that number for a long time. Then I thought about Poppy asleep downstairs, and I closed the notepad and told myself I'd figure it out. I didn't figure it out. I just kept not figuring it out. What changed things was my birthday. I turned 68 on the 14th of March. In Canada, March is not a pretty month. The snow is gray and heavy. Everything feels like it's been winter forever. But I'd always loved my birthday. Lorraine used to make a point of it. She'd plan something, even if it was just a long drive up to Elora for lunch and a walk along the gorge. After she passed, I started doing small things for myself on my birthday. A nice dinner, a bottle of good wine, maybe a call from my daughter in Vancouver. That Saturday, I had planned to make a leg of lamb. It's a dish I learned from Lorraine's mother, a Newfoundlander who could make anything out of anything, and I had been looking forward to it all week. I had the lamb marinating overnight. I had my playlist ready, a mix of Gordon Lightfoot and some jazz that Lorraine used to put on for company. I came downstairs at 11 in the morning on my birthday to find Candace in the kitchen. The lamb was still in the fridge, but the counter where I had planned to work was covered, entirely covered, with her meal prep containers, a cutting board, her laptop, and a collection of spice jars she had rearranged from my pantry. I said, "Good morning. I was going to start on the lamb around noon. It's my birthday dinner." She didn't look up from her laptop. "I'm in the middle of something right now. Can you wait until I'm done?" I said, reasonably. "I just need a bit of counter space." "Hugh," I said, "I'm in the middle of something." Her voice had a tone I had been hearing more and more over the past several months. Not angry, exactly. More the way you'd speak to a child who keeps interrupting. I stood there for a moment, and then I said, "Candace, this is my kitchen. I would like to use it." That's when she looked up. And that is when she said it, clearly, without hesitation, with the absolute confidence of someone who had forgotten entirely that the floor beneath her feet belonged to someone else. "Then maybe you should wait downstairs until I'm finished. This is my home now, too." She hadn't said our home. She hadn't said I feel at home here. She said. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the leg of lamb. I thought about Lorraine's mother's recipe, handwritten on an index card that I still kept in the kitchen drawer. I thought about the 24 months of grocery bills and utility payments, and Tuesday afternoons in the park with Poppy. I said, "All right." I went to my bedroom. I closed the door quietly. I sat on the edge of the bed where Lorraine used to sleep, and I opened my phone to a contact I had saved 2 months earlier. Gwen Fairchild, a legal assistant I had met through my chess club, whose sister was a paralegal specializing in tenant and landlord situations. I had actually called Gwen in January after a particularly bad week. I hadn't been sure I was ready to do anything, but I had wanted to understand my options. What she told me was this: in Ontario, a family member living in your home without a formal lease is still considered a tenant under certain interpretations of the Residential Tenancies Act. But because the situation was informal, and the property owner was the one asking them to leave, I had more flexibility than I might think. However, she recommended I document everything, every month without contribution, every modification to the house, everything, and then issue a formal written notice requesting they vacate within 60 days. She also told me something else. If I wanted to claim the unpaid contributions, I could take it to Small Claims Court. Ontario Small Claims Court handles disputes up to $35,000. My $9,000 was comfortably within that range. I had spent the past 2 months quietly documenting, a spreadsheet on my laptop, photos of the furniture Candace had brought in, notes about the conversations, dated, detailed, my hydro bills month by month. I had been thorough. I am an engineer. Thorough is what I do. I texted Gwen. "I'm ready. Can we meet this week?" She replied within 10 minutes. "Tuesday works. Come by at 2. I put my phone down. I went back to the kitchen. Candace had moved to the living room by then. I cleared the counter myself, got the lamb out of the fridge, and I cooked my birthday dinner. It took me 3 hours. It was excellent. I ate alone at the kitchen table, with a glass of Niagara Cabernet and Lorraine's good china, and Biscuit sat under my chair the way he always does, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was standing on solid ground. Ross and Candace went out that evening, didn't mention where, didn't ask about my dinner. Poppy was with Candace's mother for the weekend. I watched the hockey game, finished the wine, and went to bed at 10. That Tuesday I met with Gwen. She was practical, efficient, and kind in the exact right proportions. She helped me draft 2 documents. The first was a formal written notice, not a legal eviction notice exactly, since the situation didn't require going through the landlord and tenant board, given the informal nature of the arrangement, but a clear, signed letter stating that I was requesting Ross and Candace vacate the property within 60 days by May 15th. It cited the original verbal agreement, the duration of the stay, and my wish to resume full use of my home. The second was a detailed accounting of the unpaid contributions, $9,200 in total, calculated conservatively, with a note that I intended to file with Ontario Small Claims Court if the amount was not addressed within 30 days of receiving the notice. I came home from that meeting, and I made a cup of tea, and I sat with those 2 documents for a while. I thought about Ross at 12 trying to ride his bicycle in the hallway. I thought about Poppy's dark, watchful eyes. I thought about the scuff on the baseboard that was still there, still part of the house. Then I printed them both out, put them in 2 separate envelopes, and set them on the kitchen counter where Candace had put her laptop. Ross came home from work at 6. He saw the envelopes. He picked them up. I was in the living room with Biscuit. I heard him open the first envelope. I heard him go quiet. Then I heard him go downstairs and say something to Candace in a low voice. Then there was silence. Then Candace's voice, sharp and rising. They came upstairs together 3 minutes later. Candace was first. "What is this?" "It's a request," I said. I kept my voice level. "That you find other arrangements within 60 days. You're kidding me." She looked at Ross. Ross was not looking at me. He was looking at the floor. "I'm not kidding," I said. "I want you to read the second document as well." Candace read it standing in the kitchen doorway. Her expression changed as she went through the figures, not to remorse, but to a kind of cold calculation I had seen before, in certain meetings at the city, when someone realizes the numbers aren't going their way. "You're going to take us to court," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'd prefer not to," I said. "But yes, if necessary." "Ross," she turned to him. "Say something." Ross finally looked up. He looked, and I am not saying this with pleasure, he looked like he had been awake for a long time. There were shadows under his eye I hadn't fully noticed before. He looked at me and said, "Dad, is this really what you want?" And I said, "Ross, I want you to understand that I love you. I love Poppy. That does not change. But this is my home, and I have let things go too far for too long, and yes, this is what I want." There was a long silence. Candace said, "I can't believe this. After everything." I didn't ask her to explain what everything meant, because I suspected I knew, and I suspected we would not agree on the accounting. They went back downstairs. I heard raised voices for about 20 minutes. I couldn't make out the words, and then quiet. The next 4 weeks were not easy. I won't pretend they were. The house felt different. Meals were awkward, or avoided. Candace stopped speaking to me directly. Ross would sometimes come upstairs in the evening and sit in the kitchen with a coffee, and we would talk about inconsequential things. The weather, the Leafs, how Biscuit's arthritis was responding to the new medication. We did not talk about the envelopes. But I could see him thinking. What I did not expect was what happened in week 3. Ross came upstairs on a Wednesday evening. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He had a piece of paper in his hand, not my document, something he had written himself. He put it on the table between us. "I've thought about the accounting," he said. "I think your number is fair. More than fair, actually." He slid the paper toward me. It was a check, $9,200. His own handwriting. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at him. "We've been talking," he said. "Candace and I. We found an apartment in Guelph, closer to the GO station. 2-bedroom. We can move in May 1st. 2 weeks before your deadline." I didn't say anything right away. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said it quietly, the way he used to apologize as a kid. Not performatively, but with that particular low-voiced shame that meant it was real. I knew things had gotten out of hand, and I didn't do anything about it. That's on me. Not just on Candace. On me. I folded the check and put it in my shirt pocket. Then I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm the way I used to when he was small. I said, "I know." They moved out on April 29th, 2 weeks early. It took them 2 days. Ross did most of the heavy lifting, literally. He hired a small moving company, 2 young guys with a truck, and by 4 in the afternoon on the second day the basement was empty. Candace carried Poppy out to the car seat without looking at me. Poppy, on the other hand, looked directly at me and said, "Pop, pop," and held out her arms, and I took her and held her for a long moment in the front hall, while Candace stood by the door with her jaw set. I handed Poppy back, I said to Candace, and I meant it sincerely. "She's a wonderful child. You should be proud." Candace didn't respond. She took Poppy to the car. Ross was last. He stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the house the way you look at something you know you won't see the same way again. Then he shook my hand, held it a beat longer than a regular handshake, and walked to his car. I stood on the porch and watched them drive away. Biscuit sat beside me, his nose working the March air. I went inside. I walked into the kitchen, and I moved the mugs back to the cabinet above the coffee maker, where they have lived for 25 years. I took Candace's laminated schedule off the refrigerator. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, and I was quiet for a moment. And I thought about Lorraine, and I thought about the crooked cabinet above the fridge that I still haven't fixed. Then I put Lorraine's good china away, and I started planning what I was going to cook for Wendell on Thursday. That was 8 months ago. Ross and I talk every week or two. He seems lighter somehow, like something that had been sitting on his shoulders has been set down. He brought Poppy over last month, just the 2 of them, and she spent 2 hours in the backyard with Biscuit, and came inside with grass stains on both knees and a look of profound satisfaction. I made grilled cheese sandwiches. We watched half a hockey game before she fell asleep on the couch. It's a start, I have been asked, since telling this story to a few people, Whether I regret not acting sooner. Whether I should have said something after the first moved mug. Whether patience, in this case, was really patience or something closer to avoidance. I think about that. I think the honest answer is both. There is a version of patience that is wisdom, knowing when to hold still, when not to escalate, when to give someone room to find their own way. And there is a version of patience that is just fear dressed up in nicer clothes. Fear of conflict. Fear of damaging something you love. Fear of being the one who made it worse. I lived in that second version for too long. I don't say that to punish myself. I am 68 years old, and I have learned that self-punishment is mostly a waste of time. But I say it because I think there are other people in situations like mine who are telling themselves that waiting is the generous choice, the mature choice, the loving choice. And sometimes it is, but sometimes the house is filling with water, and you're standing there with a bucket, too polite to say anything, and eventually the foundation gives. The document I printed out on a Tuesday evening in March was not the end of my relationship with my son. I know that now. It was the beginning of something more honest. My daughter called from Vancouver the week after they moved out. She had known something of what was going on. I had told her a little, not wanting to put her in the middle. When I told her it was resolved, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, I've been worried about you for 2 years. I should have said something. We're a family of people who don't say things," I said. "Maybe we could try being different," she said. I said, "I'd like that." Biscuit is doing better, by the way. The arthritis medication seems to be working, and last week he actually chased a squirrel in the backyard. Didn't come close, obviously. He's 14 and considerably more round than he used to be, but there was commitment in the effort. And I cheered for him from the back porch, and for a moment the yard was full of noise, and spring was finally coming, and it really felt like home.